The native girl. That's how I was known. I hate it. I'm not just a native girl. I want to be known as Eddie Mukwa, just a normal girl like everyone else in my school. I hated being the center of attention, but in school, it was a role that I couldn't escape. I'm only 13, and I already learned how to tune out most of the stares, the whispers, and the unsolicited questions that followed me. Living in Edmonton, a city that prided itself on diversity, where students from every corner of the world mingled in classrooms that looked like a mosaic of cultures. Yet, in the sea of differences, I often felt like I was the only one who truly didn't belong. My school, like the city, was full of cultures. You could find kids from North America, South America, Europe, Africa, and Asia in the hallways, speaking in a dozen different languages, their clothes reflecting the worlds that they came from. But I wasn't seen as one of them. No, I was the native girl, and the label followed me wherever I went. In a class of 30 students, when teachers discussed Indigenous topics, whether it was about residential schools, the 60s scoop, or the history of treaties, it was me who always got the eyes. I didn't even have to raise my hand. It was like a magnetic force pulled everyone's attention towards me. "Hey Eddie, your people went through that, right?" A student would ask, making it sound more like an awkward statement than a question. The worst part? The teachers, especially the older ones, didn't seem to notice the uncomfortable tension they created. Miss MacDonald, the history teacher, would look at me with a sympathetic smile whenever the topic of residential schools came up. "Eddie, maybe you can tell us about what your grandfather went through. You know, the ones who were sent to those schools. You're so brave for sharing." I wasn't brave. I was tired of my history being paraded around as though it was some tragic story only I could tell. Tired of the stares, and tired of the awkward pauses that followed when I said little more than, "I don't really know my grandfather's history." It wasn't that I didn't care about my heritage. I did, but the constant pulling me into these conversations made me feel like I was being singled out for something I didn't choose. It made me feel small, as if my identity was only worth something when it was used to fulfill the curiosity of others. And then there were the teachers. Miss MacDonald's well-meaning attempts to highlight Indigenous issues often missed the mark. I had heard the same speech at least a dozen times. Canada has a dark past when it comes to Indigenous peoples. They've suffered so much, and it's up to us to fix things. But none of it made me feel seen. In fact, it made me feel worse. It made me feel like I was just a relic of a past no one truly cared about. And every time a teacher or a student asked me to speak about my culture, it felt like a silent expectation. "You, as the native girl, will tell us everything we need to know about what happened. It's your responsibility to be the voice of all Indigenous people." My classmates, most of whom had never interacted with someone who looked like me, were oblivious to the weight of the spotlight they put on me. Some of them even asked things like, "So, do you live in a teepee? Or do you speak your language?" They thought they were being respectful, but they were only exposing their ignorance. It was painful, yet I said nothing. Until one day, something inside of me snapped. It started in the middle of a history lesson. Miss MacDonald was explaining the significance of the Indian Act, and once again, all eyes turned to me, as if I were the living embodiment of all of Canada's wrongs. "Eddie," Miss MacDonald began, "could you share with the class how the Indian Act still affects Indigenous people today?" That was enough. I had heard the same question asked 100 times before, but today, something inside me wanted to speak up, to finally say what had been festering inside of me for so long. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaky but determined. "You ask me about these things like I'm supposed to have all the answers. But I don't, and I'm not your personal history lesson. Just because I'm of Indigenous descent doesn't mean you can treat me like a walking textbook." The class went silent. Miss MacDonald blinked, taken aback. My heart raced in my chest, but I didn't stop. "It's not that I don't care," I continued, my voice growing stronger. "It's that I'm tired. I'm tired of being the native girl. I'm tired of you all looking at me like I'm the only one who can tell you everything about residential schools or treaties. You want to know about my culture? Then ask me. Don't just put me on the spot every time we talk about Indigenous history." I could feel the heat rise in my cheeks, but it didn't matter anymore. The words were spilling out, raw and unfiltered. "I'm not a spokesperson for all Indigenous people," I continued, my eyes scanning around the room. "I'm just a kid. I live here in Edmonton like everyone else. I go to school. I hang out with my friends. I don't have all the answers to fix everything, and I shouldn't have to carry that responsibility." There was a long pause, the kind that made the air thick with tension. I could see my classmates staring, wide-eyed like deer in headlights. Miss MacDonald stood there, her mouth slightly agape, unsure of how to respond. Finally, a voice broke the silence. It was Cheyenne, the girl who sat behind me in math. She wasn't one to speak out often, but when she did, it was clear and honest. Eddie's right, Cheyenne said. We shouldn't expect her to speak for everyone. We all have our own stories. Just because she's Native doesn't mean she has to represent all of us or carry all that history. We should be the ones learning, not her teaching. The room murmured in agreement. It was a small victory, but to me, it was everything. The weight that had been crushing my chest all these years finally began to lift. Miss MacDonald nodded slowly, her expression softening. I see. I'm sorry, Eddie. It wasn't my intention. We'll do better from now on, okay? I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The message had been sent, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a burden. After class, as I walked down the hallway, my heart still raced, but now it was with relief. A voice called out my name behind me. I looked back, and Cheyenne caught up to me. You okay? She asked. I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. Yeah, I think I'm going to be. From that day forward, I was no longer the Native girl in the eyes of my peers. I was just Eddie. Just a kid trying to make my way through a world that often didn't know how to see me. But the moment I spoke up, things started to change. Teachers began to ask all their students to share their experiences, not just the ones who looked different. And slowly, the conversation around Indigenous issues shifted from curiosity to respect. I didn't have to speak for my entire heritage anymore. I could just be myself. I was still a Native girl, but I was no longer the Native girl. It wasn't a perfect fix, but it was a start. And for me, that was enough.